Let's talk about the White House Conference on Nutrition. Now, this is the first White House Conference on Nutrition in over 53 years. Pretty dramatic. And the goals are laudable: to eliminate hunger, right? To talk about nutrition and health, to decrease the impact that nutrition has on chronic diseases. These are fantastic goals. Great to have the government talking about it. But what about the details? How are they going to do it? What actually happened at the conference? Who was there? What was the energy like? Well, we've got two pretty cool interviews to talk exactly about that. First is Nina Teicholz, who you've seen before here at Diet Doctor, and we just launched a podcast with her where we talked about the White House Conference on Nutrition before it happened. So this is perfect to get her follow-up take on it now that it's happened. And the second is Kevin Kumler, who's the president at Virta Health. And he was actually there. He was in the room where it happened, right? He was part of the conference. So really cool to get his perspective on the energy, the vibe, what it was like to be there, and his take on the role of industry, the role of government, and what was talked about and how to move forward as the next step. So for Nina, we've talked about before how you can find her on Substack for Unsettled Science, and of course on Twitter, where she's very active. And then for Kevin, who's the president of Virta Health, he's on Twitter and LinkedIn at Kevin Kumler. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with both of them. It was very enlightening about this White House Conference on Nutrition. Well, Nina, welcome back.
Great to see you, Brett. It's been a while.
Yeah, our podcast just launched yesterday. So if people haven't heard the podcast, I recommend they go back and hear the podcast. But now this is like the perfect timing for the follow-up on this White House Conference of Nutrition. We talked about it in the podcast, but we can give a little primer again now that it was, the first time in 53 years that the White House hosted a conference on nutrition, with the goals being to address hunger, nutrition, and health. Overall, the reception that I see seems to be a lot of people really excited about this, that it was great that we're even talking about it, that it's on the docket. But then when you dig deeper, it's like, well, what was really accomplished, and what are some of the more specifics about what happened? And that's why I'm thrilled to have you on, because I know you always do your homework and you always dig so deeply about these things. So if you can, give us sort of your overall impression of this conference.
Yeah, I do first want to just echo your thought about how important it is that nutrition is being addressed as all. President Biden opened the conference by saying, we're just realizing how important nutrition is in various kinds of diseases we didn't even know. Those of us who are following the research have known this, but it's so important for, especially an administration that did not make a single recommendation about nutrition and better diet throughout the entire pandemic, when the studies were repeatedly showing that high blood sugar and obesity were some of the strongest predictors of poor outcomes and death from COVID. So
Right.
This is so long overdue, and it's extremely important that there is now attention being focused on this. What concerns me is that the solutions, by and large, are either vegan, which is more extreme, kind of low-fat, plant-based, and that's mainly coming out of the private sector, or from the government, more of the same, right? So let's just take the government first. Biden pronounced, the 24 hours before the conference, and this was consistent with the extreme secrecy with which the conference was planned. There was almost no information on the agenda until the night before. The speakers were released without any bios or links. I still can't tell you really anything about the people who spoke at the conference. And this 44-page plan was released by Biden 24 hours in advance, and it includes a number of initiatives that are about more nutrition education, more reimbursement for nutrition education. It all sounds great, right? More funding for school meals for kids so that they do not go hungry. Nutrition counseling for people who are getting Medicaid or Medicare programs, for people who are poor or the elderly. All of that sounds fantastic, except that all of that will be based on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's all predicated on that, self-evidently failed policy, right? Mm-hmm. And when I say that, I don't say that lightly. It's just that obesity in America was under 14% in 1980 when the dietary guidelines were launched. Now it's at 43% or higher. And so, whatever you say about the guidelines, and people have followed them pretty well, according to the best available government data, they just haven't succeeded in preventing these terrible diseases. So more of the same seems, unwarranted, or at least like a non-reflective, non-analytic way of going about this. So that is upsetting. And some of the government proposals include sort of doubling down even more. So there's a proposal that was released to enforce lower sodium standards in school lunches. Well, is there any data that lowering sodium for children will result in any benefit, much
Yeah.
less to say will not cause harm? This is the amount of data on them.
Yeah. Well,
So,
what
I
it
mean,
will do is make them probably not like the taste of the food and not eat it. That's the one thing I can think would happen. And you're right.
right,
No proven
right.
benefit to low sodium diets in kids. So that's oh man, that's
Right.
frustrating.
And in adult populations, excessive lowering of sodium has been shown to increase or to be associated with increased
Yes.
risk, and in populations, especially non-hypertensive populations. So that suggests that there could be some harm. So that's a non-evidence-based recommendation. There was, in addition, a proposal unveiled on this at the sort of the moment of the White House conference by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, saying we want a label to put the healthy word on the front of food packages, updated to include low sodium, low saturated fat, and I think it was supposed to be lower in sugar, but they're kind of edging away from what would arguably be like the one most important thing and actually evidence-based thing they could do, which is to lower sugar. So, keeping saturated fat low is also a non-evidence-based solution.
Yeah, how's that heart healthy label been working when we see heart healthy labels on, Honey Nut Cheerios and Fruit Loops and things like that? It's clear that the healthy label has not really worked as designed and is more of a big food kind of benefit, if
It's
anything
a
else. So would
marketing
this be,
tool.
yeah, a marketing
Yeah.
tool,
So, I mean,
exactly.
you're talking about the American Heart Association label, which was on like Fruit Loops or Twix or whatever.
Right, right.
But the government label, these are on the front of packaged foods. And I guess maybe the best we can say about them is that consumers are now so jaded about nutrition advice that maybe they'll just ignore them, and not really take it so seriously. But in any case, it does say something to consumers about what is healthy. So that's the government side, which you might think, I mean, there's so little that we really know about this conference, but it's possible that that's like relatively minor. And a number of these proposals depend upon congressional passage, which is, to have the Congress actually legislate them. That is unlikely to happen before the midterm elections. So it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. I mean, these are kind of like a wish list, really, that may or may not happen.
Hmm.
On the other side, you have the private sector, or some is local governments, but mainly private sector investment. $8 billion have been pledged by all kinds of actors. I looked into some of these. So there's 8 billion pledged by over 100 private businesses, local governments, and philanthropies. For instance, something called S2G Ventures and Food Systems for the Future announced a new coalition that would invest $2.5 billion in a new fund dedicated to ending hunger and fixing our health. So I looked into some of those, who's participating in this. They have a coalition partner, Rich Products Ventures. What are they doing? They're making fake egg proteins. The Future Systems for the Food is dedicated to insect proteins. That's their main investment. They have
Yeah.
another partner that makes fake seafood. I mean, so these are all companies that are devoted to, sustainability. They want to make a better planet, better for health, but it's all about really creating these highly processed food. That's where the profit margin is, that would replace largely animal proteins and, create new markets for new foods. And that's, it was always my suspicion that that was what was going into the conference, were a bunch of investors who are interested in creating new markets. I mean, this is what the food industry is about, which is creating new markets for people, not just new foods, but new ways of treating disease through apps and programs. I mean, maybe one hopeful item coming out of this is that there are a number of provisions in the National Strategy Plan by Biden calling for medically tailored meals. and which is sort of around the idea of kind of precision nutrition, giving different meals to different people, not having a one size fits all diet. And
Yes.
I think maybe there's a way for lower carbohydrate meals, for particularly for people with diabetes, to maybe enter in under that rubric. But I can't say at this point that I have any insider information on that.
Yeah, well, you've talked so much about the dietary guidelines and how they're not meant for people who have any chronic medical conditions, which, if you talk about metabolic dysfunction being a chronic medical condition, that makes it about 7% of the population. Or even if you just talk about people who aren't overweight or have type 2 diabetes, we're still talking about a minority of the population. So was there much of a discussion about well, I guess you sort of just answered that question. It sounds like there was a little bit of discussion about having different recommendations for different people, but that clearly wasn't the mainstay of the discussion. The mainstay of the discussion sounds like it still is around this one size fits all dietary guidelines for everyone. Is
Yeah.
that about right?
Yeah, and yes, I mean that's was what the focus of the Biden administration's plan was. And let's remember, it's the law for any federal program on nutrition to follow those guidelines. So
Mm-hmm.
there's not even much room for leeway, even if you wanted it. What was actually being discussed at the conference seemed to have really very little relationship to all the agendas that I've been able to discover behind it. I mean, it was a lot of people from underserved communities, people working on the front lines with very poor people and populations, and which was great to see. But I was pretty aware that the massive corporate interests behind this conference and funding it all the way up were not on stage. I don't know. There was to me like a pretty big disconnect between
Hmm.
what was staged and what was really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, so question about the $8 billion. I think it's important to clarify. So that's not $8 billion coming from the government. That's $8 billion coming from the private sector, sort of
Correct.
pledged. Now, what's the government's role in that money or those initiatives? Or is there at
Yeah,
this point?
that's a good question, right? I mean, this is sort of the government gets to boast that they've been able to corral all this funding behind the kinds of initiatives that they would like to see. But is there a like implicit quid pro quo that the government
Yeah.
will ease the way in in terms of regulations, or give these programs preference? I mean, that I think is part of the like opaque unknown part of this conference. You really just don't know what kind of partnerships are happening behind the scenes. Let me give you two other examples. One is
Yeah.
that $250 million was pledged by the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Heart Association and Kroger's grocery chain for an initiative called Food is Medicine. That is also being proposed to be funded as a pilot program for next year. It's actually in the congressional appropriation for next year, and we don't know if it'll be passed. But that's like this. So you've got philanthropy, American Heart Association, extremely close to the government. What that will look like, it's really hard to know. I mean, our idea of food as medicine, you and me, is very different than what the American Heart Association has historically thought is food as medicine, right? They're the original authors of the diet heart hypothesis, saying you shouldn't
Right.
eat saturated fat and cholesterol. So I think it's we really don't know what will happen with that. And another example is $22 million was pledged by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. That group was originally named the Christian College of Lifestyle Medicine. That is a group that is a Seventh-day Adventist church group. They believe in a nuts, seeds, basically a vegan diet, as a matter of faith. So that is their religious faith and belief. They have pledged $22 million to educate healthcare practitioners on their diet. And that has been accepted by the government, this faith-based initiative, as part of this food as medicine kind of rollout. So it's, I mean, to me, that's a crazy, in the field of science, that's a crazy like marriage of church and government, where we're really not supposed to be doing that. So it's just part of these like really conflicting, conflated, and competing agendas coming from very different motives and backgrounds.
Yeah, I was afraid that this was going to be the story. I mean, there's so much excitement on social media and that we're talking about this, but then when you get into the details, like you've uncovered, it really is disappointing that it's more of the same biases, more of the same poor science, like you've been talking about for years with the dietary guidelines, and really just ups the ante on how important it is to base the dietary guidelines on better science, on real science, and to open the options for the dietary guidelines rather than thinking there's just one diet for everybody. And it's the way it's been for the past 50 years. But we know better now. Over the past 50 years, we were hoodwinked by the packaged food industry, but now we know better, so we can make it work this time. I don't think that's the case. So, do you think this will increase the charge for changing the dietary guidelines because they're now that much more important? Or do you think now that the White House has shown they're going to double down on the dietary guidelines, it's going to make them that much harder to change?
Well, I really, I'm reluctant to make predictions because people who make predictions are always wrong. But
That's a good
I
prediction.
think you could see a silver lining potentially that if the dietary guidelines are, if nutrition is elevated as an important component for health, which I think we agree is a positive. It means that if you can change the guidelines, if you could, for instance, as in a proposal that is actually currently being suggested in Congress, if you can change those guidelines to include a low carbohydrate option, and those guidelines are more powerful, that could potentially be really beneficial to people. And that would be because it would be disseminated out to the public in ways that are effective. So, but if that doesn't happen, then you have more power, more impetus behind pushing out like basically a high carbohydrate diet, low in animal foods, low in cholesterol and salt, and all of that will. I think it's been demonstrably shown what will do at the very least will do nothing to improve health.
Mm-hmm. And at the very worst will worsen health, as we've seen over 50 years. At least create the environment for people to be hungry and looking for other products and other calories to feed that hunger, and then
Right.
potentially worsen health. Right. That is frustrating. So now that we've had the conference and we've had all the pomp and circumstance around the conference, what's next? Like, what can we look for next as an outcome to this conference? Or is it going to take years to see any next steps?
I think the next steps will unfold over years. As I said, there's unlikely to be any legislative changes that Congress will consider anytime soon, given the midterm elections. After the elections, it's because the Democrats are likely to lose the House. It's unlikely the Biden administration will be able to push through anything because they no longer have the kind of political power that they used to. I think what we will see happen is this proposal for the healthy labeling that's going to be rolled out by the Food and Drug Administration, and anything that they can do from an executive order or regulatory position through the agencies. I think we will see that, and certainly all those investments will definitely be all of that will go forward in the private sector. I think a lot will happen behind closed doors that we just won't know about.
Yeah.
Um, so, I'll be working to keep an eye on it.
Yeah, well, I look forward to hearing more from what you uncover. And it's, ending hunger, improving nutrition, reducing diet-related chronic diseases are so important and such worthy goals that we need to talk about it, but we need to find solutions that are actually going to work for most people, and a variety of solutions, not just one solution. And unfortunately, it sounds like this isn't the best first step. But thank you for coming on again and to the show and really sort of uncovering and helping us understand the details behind this.
Thank you, Britt. It's great to talk to you.
Well, Kevin, I'm really excited to get your take on this White House conference on nutrition because you were there. You were in the room. I saw you with your suit and you looked really great. And I don't say that to be glib, though. I say that because, it was an important event with a lot of excitement surrounding it about what could be. So give us your take on what it was like to be there in this conference room with all this excitement.
Thanks so much. And thanks again for having me, Brett.
Yeah.
It was a really exciting week and a really exciting event. I've certainly never been in a room like that. And I don't think many of the people there had, because this is the first time a conference like this has been held in 53 years, which is sort of mind blowing. And part of that energy, I think, was just the pent up demand and energy to talk about these issues that those of us healthcare nerds are thinking about every day, but don't get the kind of national attention that some of the short news cycle stuff gets. But you had several hundred people there representing public sector, private sector, not for profit, both sides of the aisle in Congress, and everyone was aligned on the same couple of issues. And there was real passion there. And the two main topics, there's a national strategy that covers 5 pillars, but it was really 2 topics people were there to talk about. Number one is eliminating hunger in the US, especially for children. In a country as wealthy as ours, that is something that I think all of us feel terrible that it still exists and want to do something about. And the second and most exciting from a Virta health standpoint, which is why I was there, is ending diet-related disease and reducing it by 2030. And there seemed to be wide acknowledgement that diet-related disease is a massive issue in this country. And to hear some of the people up on stage talking about it was just a really energizing experience, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, you posted on your LinkedIn profile the talk by Cory Booker, whom I claim to fame I went to college with, but even though, I don't think I really knew him, but went to college with him. Great. Seems like a really good guy, and he very well spoken. The way he laid out the problem that we're facing in this country was very clear. But as you said, it's a problem that we know, right? People in the nutrition field, in the health field, have known for decades about this growing problem. And I guess you could say it's nice to see the government sort of catching up and starting to talk about it. So the problem is well identified. What are your take homes as to some of the solutions and ways forward that can come out of this type of a conference?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was awesome to hear Senator Booker up there talking about the stuff that we usually talk about, and why he's a politician and I'm not, is that he could reduce a really complex issue to a couple of sound bites injected with passion that made us want to jump out of our seats. And calling out the sheer cost of what we're doing. He called out that we spend about $1 out of every $3 in this country on healthcare, and that about 80% of those dollars are preventable. And that really is at the core. And then he called out some of the clear health equity issues around the causes that we're most focused on, which are diabetes and prediabetes, pointing out that 50% of Americans have diabetes or prediabetes, roughly. And in Black and brown communities, people are 77% more likely to get diabetes and twice as likely to die from it. So the clarity and passion around the problem was clear. And then on solutions, there were a lot of stuff that people were bringing kind of to the fore. From our point of view, a couple things that we heard is, number one, food as medicine is no longer seen as a gimmick, but actually a mainstream solution. Food is not a main topic in the healthcare system. You don't have to go further than the average hospital cafeteria to understand that. They don't take nutrition probably as seriously as they could. But from a policy, health plan, health system, food bank point of view, they are seeing food as a core medicine that can treat disease. And obviously that's very aligned with what we're doing at Virta. The promise of technology, and this isn't just the sort of Buck Rogers version of technology, although there's some cool examples of that. There was a machine there in the lobby where they were showing off how it could grow salad without any sunlight, taking various technologies around irrigation and UV rays to grow fresh fruits and vegetables in places where you normally can't, all the way to the kind of technology that we use to remotely connect with people in their home and be able to bring the best of medicine to them, so they don't have to necessarily live in a city or have access to a big fancy hospital full of people in white coats to get the kind of intervention they need.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about this conference is it's billed as the White House conference, or like a government conference, but yet there seemed to be a big presence from the private sector. And was there a lot of discussion about not just how the government can help, but how private sector can help? And I guess the second part of that question, was there any discussion about how the two can align to kind of help each other have a greater impact?
Yeah, that was a huge part of it, actually, the concept of partnership. And there were some great examples of this. The second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, talked a lot about this, about public-private partnership. Ambassador Rice was imploring people from the beginning. This is not something that the White House can issue a 45-page PDF strategy and then magic happens. They do have a pretty powerful pulpit to speak from. They do have policy, which can drive dollars. But ultimately, they were looking to encourage and collaborate with everyone there and get us to collaborate with each other. So in the afternoon, we had working sessions where people would go to different tables, and I was at one of the food is medicine tables talking about what can we do differently across our organizations or together to create better outcomes. And that, for me, was a really exciting part, to actually be part of the work happening at the conference, not just hearing people talk about it.
Yeah, so that's really cool that there were these breakout groups where you could actually meet and discuss and brainstorm. So I'm curious, what kind of government representation was there at those breakout groups? And so is there an ability to get those discussions, kind of up the flagpole, so to speak, to have some impact?
Yeah, but the people who were there all day. So you would see, the senators, the Congress people, the administrators, interacting with all of us as we went through. At my table, our moderator was the director of research from the NIH.
Yeah.
And so he's thinking about how this can impact their research priorities, while I'm sitting across from somebody who works at Kaiser Permanente, and somebody on the other side who works for a food bank, and somebody who is at a academic medical center, and then us, Virta, is sort of a digital innovator, all recognizing some of the same issues and seeing that we each have a role we can play. And I thought Sachin Jain from SCAN articulated it really well in his panel, where he was saying the real opportunity here is to create an ecosystem of innovation, not just change the guidelines, which we all hope that guidelines get changed and policy drives stuff forward, but it is bringing in new ideas, seeing which ones flourish and drive outcomes that are going to lead to the kind of population level health outcomes we all want to see in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting about innovation and how important that is. But in the same topic, is the same sentence as innovation, you also mentioned the guidelines. So was there much a discussion about the dietary guidelines, or was that just sort of implied and it was like, what else can we do?
Yeah, I think that was partially implied, and it was, a subset of one of the pillars, right? They had 5 pillars: improve food access and affordability. Within that, you could talk about access to which food and what types of affordability, and there were a lot of ideas around it. The second one was integrating nutrition and health, putting the two things closer together, which is obviously at the core of what we do. The third was empowering all consumers to make and have access to healthy choices. And in particular, a lot of the work that we're doing around health equity, we think that's a very big deal. In any community, there should be the opportunity for people to make better choices that will improve their health. And how do we give them that power, give them that education, and help them do it? The fourth was around physical activity and supporting that for all people. And the fifth was around enhancing nutrition and food security research so that we have an even better foundation going forward. So under each of those, there was a pretty big conversation, but the guidelines for exactly which form of nutrition should we be pushing wasn't really a huge topic, because there's so much to solve across all of these areas.
Yeah, I mean, just listing those 5 things and thinking about how each one has, a whole tree of branches of the tree that need to be done to sort of see real change. On the one hand, it sounds a little intimidating, like, my goodness, how are we going to do all this? So what was your take home about like the next steps, or what you think should or could happen next? What's the government plans? What's the private sector plans? How does the next step take place so that it's not just, a good week and a good discussion, but actually actionable content comes out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on who you are and what you're already working on. There are some people who showed up who have a role to play, but are new to the discussion in really interesting ways. So my friend Claire Reichenbach from the James Beard Foundation was there, and the James Beard chefs prepared the food. They really want to get involved in this concept of nutrition, and they obviously have a very large following around food and now bringing food to health, which was an interesting connection. There were large corporations there, especially the food retailers, Kroger was there, Meyer was there, talking about massive investments they're going to make in making healthy food more available. If you're a company like Virta, from our point of view, we've been working on disease reversal through nutrition and lifestyle change for 7 years. We just published our 5-year clinical trial outcomes this summer. It was only a year ago that the American Diabetes Association came out and sort of validated reversal and remission of disease as a category within diabetes. And now this White House thing is happening. So for us, it's really about running forward with speed and working with a lot of partners in the room who are more the early adopters and can help us reach scale. And then there are some others who I think are going to have some big questions they've got to answer, because maybe what they've been doing to date isn't leading to the best outcomes. And so I think that some of those organizations are going to have to take a hard look in the mirror and figure out what do they need to do to be a part of this. And so I think it really depends on where you are in the conversation, where you are in your own journey.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned the food, so I got to ask, unfortunately, when you go to a lot of medical conferences, it's donuts and danishes and cookies. And how was the food? What did they serve you?
I'm so glad you asked that. I chose the vegetarian option this time, and it was a vegetarian tuna poke. So it wasn't actually fish, but it approximated fish. And it was on a delicious, like there were 3 components, all delicious, all healthy. And it was completely different from, I've honestly been to 4 healthcare conferences in the last month, completely different than the others, where people are acknowledging some of the same issues. And then you go out to grab food and it's a gigantic carb and sugar buffet. Kind of embarrassingly, when I was at last week, one of the moderators came back in after lunch and he said, I had 3 or 4 of those peanut butter cookies at lunch. I think I need to go get some insulin. And you're just thinking problem we're all here to discuss, and we're making jokes about it. So
that's awful.
I was actually really impressed that they had thought through it at that level to really walk the talk, and connecting it to local chefs, local food, and some of the same topics that we're trying to solve throughout the country. If you can't solve it at a conference, how the heck are you going to solve it in the community? And I think they really thought that part through.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah. Well, so, I mean, it does sound like it's a great first step, and there a lot of the responsibility does fall on individuals and on individual companies, like you said, based on where you are, and on the government to help see this through. Any other sort of take homes or things that really impressed you about the conference?
Certainly the level of energy and engagement.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you go to these things, you see people zip in and zip out. They're just there for their photo op, and the people who are here seem to really want to be here. And some of the leaders were so articulate and passionate from different areas. Jose Andres, the chef, who's been doing a lot of work in disaster relief areas, his passion, we were ready to go sprinting through the wall afterwards and go out and solve this problem, because he is such a dedicated leader on this issue. So that kind of was number one. Number two is the idea that the time is here for this, that we've all seen the increasing rates of, certainly obesity, prediabetes, diabetes in this country. Several people pointed out that, not that many years ago, there wasn't a state in the country that had a 35% obesity rate. We're at 19 states at a 35% obesity rate. So, as Chef Andres said, it's a national security issue. And a national security priority for us to fix food and nutrition in this country. And that is not something that I've certainly heard before. It had felt previously like people viewed this as a nice to have, or as Senator Booker said, we're the frog in the proverbial boiling water, and now we need to realize the water is boiling and we've got to do something. And then people had real solutions. And again, some of them were quite nascent and early, and others, like our work as Sachin had said with SCAN, we've been doing this now for years in different communities and demonstrating that. So it's all about how do you continue to improve and iterate on what you have. So, you're continuing to grow and get better, but, ultimately figure out who can you work with to pull this stuff forward faster. And that sense of community and trust was clear. And I'd say the last thing, and this was especially on the policy side, there was a very big focus on people with lived experience. And a lot of that was around the primary pillar around hunger, lived experience in those issues being pulled in to be part of the solution, as opposed to, maybe being interviewed once or twice, but ultimately people who had not lived the issue, coming up with a solution. So I really appreciated that perspective.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your perspective on someone who was there and felt the excitement. I mean, it sounds like it was very successful at mobilizing people, at inspiring people. And of course, solutions not going to come after one conference. It's a kicking off point. So hopefully there will be, the appropriate follow-up from all parties involved to move this forward so we start to see some real change. But it really sounds like this was a great way to define the problem, to make people more aware of the problem, and inspire people to solve the problem, something that you've been doing at Virta Health for years. So I appreciate that. And thanks for taking the time to share your experience with us.
Thanks for having me.